Good evening, everybody. We're on YouTube Live, actually, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And now we're going live on Facebook also. So just give us a second. In 3 seconds, we'll start what we have to say. This week's Parsha is Parashath Noah, the second Parsha of the year, actually the fourth Sabbath of the year. It's been a long year. Some Sabbaths we don't have a Parsha. So we'll just have to make do with the Parshas, the Shabbases that do have a Parsha to talk about. I advertised that we're going to be talking about the primacy of the land of Israel. This is the first Parasha that actually discusses a world that we recognize. However you choose to interpret the beginning of the book of Genesis, you will note that we can only really begin to understand historical realities from this week's Parasha because whatever may have been was wiped out by the flood. So the Torah will not address anything that's prehistorical. It basically picks up accurate, definable history that we can find evidence of with the story of Abraham. And there it says that it was Abraham's father who actually took the initiative to transport or transplant his family, his two surviving sons and their wives, and his grandchildren, and they left Ur Kasdim, and they went on their way to the land of Canaan, and they got to Haran, which is along the way, but they stopped there. And that's basically, like I've said in years past, that's the precedent for, let's say, those of us who make Aliyah, we immigrate to Israel, and we leave our ancestors behind. Sometimes many people, the impetus for originally Aliyah is something they picked up at the home. They had these ideals from their upbringings, but they never actually put it into practice. Their families never did that, and then they themselves continue. So that's what it means to tell us. Terach brought his family on the way. It was his initiative. They got mostly there, but then he stopped, and it says that Terach died in Haran. I saw one well-known Kofer commented that Abraham continued on his journey only after Terach had passed away, but that's actually against explicit verses. You just have to put them together. Terach died at quite an advanced age. He basically died sometime after Isaac was born, which is long after Abraham actually made it to the land of Canaan at the age of 75. Be that as it may, this is something very important. We're trying to wonder, why would this be? And actually, the details in the parasha right before that sort of explain this to us. It tells us that after the flood, Noah began trying to cultivate this world. It says the first thing he did was he planted a vineyard, and he drank, and he got drunk from it. And it says that there was an unpleasant incident whereby he cursed his youngest son's child, Canaan, who was already born at the time, and he blessed the other two sons, Shem and Japheth. And he basically made it that that Canaan, Ham's son, was going to be a servant unto them. It basically also seems that Shem's only children were born after the flood, whereas this Canaan was perhaps born right before the flood because he's already capable of doing naughty things sometime right after the flood. And then the Torah actually gives much detail into the land of the Canaanim. It says it doesn't define Eretz Canaan. It defines instead the borders of the Canaanite peoples. It says it starts all the way up north in Sidon. Sidon, they say, is the firstborn of Canaan, and also Heth, which turns out was quite a mighty empire that stretched into Asia Minor and only had a few of its representatives actually in what we know classically as land of Canaan. And there's so much detail put into this, actually defining who the Canaani are and where they would live. By the way, on their southern border, it says is Sodom and Gomorrah at the Dead Sea. And this detail is there to show us that there's something special about this land, even though the people who populated it were cursed to be eventually servants, vassals of the people who would come descended from Shem. Also, much detail is given about, for example, the major empires that would play a role in Jewish history up until Second Temple times. That's why a lot of details given about where Egypt is and the descendants of the eponymous ancestor of the Egyptians in the surrounding areas, and also to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. We know very much about Bavel, where it was, major cities, who settled it, who the kings were, and also about the Assyrians, Ashur, who's also a Semitic people, because these major empires, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, were the biggest oppressors of the Jewish people back in biblical times. The Egyptians need no introduction. They're the ones who afflicted the Jewish people and kept them and held them in servitude, forced servitude for a few centuries before the Exodus. And the Assyrians were the ones who eventually led the 10 tribes into exile, and they've been lost in history since then. And the Babylonians completed the exile and also destroyed the first temple. So those are the details there. We see the primacy of the land of Israel here. Somehow, Abraham and his family figured out the importance of that land and also realized the role that those people who occupy it would eventually play. That is, they eventually have to come and replace them. There's a few midrashim that point out, the Canaanites were the original speakers of what you and I would now call today a Proto-Hebrew, whereas in the eastern lands, in what is Assyria and Babylon, Ur, other places where Abraham grew up, the spoken language was related to Hebrew, but it wasn't. It was mostly what we would call Proto-Aramaic and other related languages, Akkadian, for example. And therefore, Abraham saw an advantage of living in the land of Israel because the people there spoke Hebrew, which would become the holy language eventually. Eventually, Chazal realized that in an esoteric way of speaking, this is the language of the Torah, and this is the language that God used to create the universe, and therefore it is a good thing that it is spoken, which, by the way, gives you some perspective on the idea that exists in certain areas in the diaspora. I remember reading about this in, for example, the Medrash saying that the Hebrew language is so holy it should not be used for mundane purposes. And really, the truth is the opposite. God intended for us to use the Hebrew language in order that we refine our characters. So, too, they say, living in the land of Israel is only for those who are already on a certain level and are not going to sin, etc. And many of us are not ready yet, for whatever reason, to live in the land of Israel. It's too holy for us, and therefore we should not live there, or we shouldn't be running to have everybody live there. And no, the opposite is the case. God wants everybody to be here, so that it refines us. We put ourselves in the land of Israel, we become better. Just like we speak Hebrew, it'll improve us. And by the way, this has to do also with the idea that some have. They take this, we described this earlier, they take this to be lichatchila. This is the desirable behavior. We shouldn't sleep in the sukkah because of its holiness. From a brisker point of view, the holiness of the sukkah, for example, derives from the fact that there is a commandment to dwell therein. A person is supposed to be in the sukkah. A person is supposed to eat in the sukkah. A person is supposed to live, that is, sleep in the sukkah. That is what generates its holiness. You can't say, it's so holy, therefore I should not sleep in it. You'd have to say, well, kal v'chomer, then you should not be sitting there and talking there, and you shouldn't be eating. It's a holy place. You shouldn't sleep there or eat there. Yet they do eat there. It's the other way around. The sukkah is holy because there is a commandment to dwell there, including sleep in there. Good. Now let's talk a little bit about the halacha. My apologies to the ladies who attended my wife's presentation yesterday. They might be familiar with this idea. This week was Rosh Hodesh, and there is, and I don't like using this term, a universal minhag, a universal custom. This is one of those customs that actually is quite universal. Everybody does this. It's in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in the Gemara. It's not when Gemara times it wasn't universal yet. They're describing the origins of this custom. We say the half Hallel, half in scare quotes. It just means Hallel with parts of it missing, or as the sages say, Hallel b'dilug, Hallel with skipping certain sections. That is said on Rosh Hodesh. And one could ask, so what's the surprise? Aren't we familiar with this? Why is it only the half Hallel? In Arachim, the tractate Arachim, on the 10th page thereof, there's a discussion there that's basically the source for the Talmudic ideas. What days should Hallel be said? And there the sages equate the recitation of what we know as the Hallel with finishing the Hallel. That is, it's a certain body of text and it should be completely said. And now I just realized perhaps that choice of word is actually the source for this. I'll first give the whole spiel, and then I'll give you my very good new idea, which I just had, that explains the answer. There's days where the complete Hallel is said, and those days are 18 in number, 18 days in the land of Israel, the 8 days of Sukkot, the 8 days of Hanukkah, the first day of Passover, and the day of Shavuot. And in Chutz La'aretz, there's Yom Tov Sheni, so you add 2 days in Sukkot. You add 1 day in Sukkot, a 9th day, and a 2nd day of Passover, and the 2nd day of Shavuot for a total of 21 days. And the Gemara there gives a reason why, for example, Hallel is not said on the Sabbath, or on New Moon's Rosh Hodesh, or on Yom Kippur, or on Rosh Hashanah. It's only meant for those holidays. And it also explains why the Hallel is not said on the latter days of Passover, even though they are fully Passover, and we do say the Hallel on the intermediary days of Sukkot, Chol Moed, and on the last Yom Tov of Chol Moed of Sukkot. But on Pesach, it's just left out. On Passover, there's no Hallel on the 7th day. There is an Agadic explanation, which is brought surprisingly in works such as the Mishnah Berurah, which explain that that's a day of the victory and the miracle that the Jewish people experienced came at the expense of their enemies who had to be destroyed. And it's a good question, since when is that even a consideration? But the Gemara says, halachically speaking, those days are not for Hallel, the recitation, because they're not a Yom Tov that is complete, because the sacrifice in the temple was just a rerun of what was the previous day. That is, as we've said before, the first day of Passover sacrifice is repeated every other day of Passover, whereas on Sukkot, there is a new sacrifice every single day. It's as though the Yom Tov has renewed itself, and therefore we say Hallel every single day of Yom Tov. You'll say, yeah, but on Hanukkah, there is no actual sacrifice even. There was no, in the temple times after Hanukkah was established, there was no Musaf, there was no special sacrifice that day. Yes, there, the Hallel is strictly because the sages ordained it as such, and they're the ones who told us what to do. So they make the rules. It's their Torah, basically. The sages make the rules, and they told us what to do, and that's what we will do. So there is no such thing as Hallel on Rosh Hodesh or Hallel on the 6 latter days of Passover, until we find the story of Rav showed up in Bavel. Rav lived in the land of Israel, was a Talmud of the Rabbi Yudan Nasi, and he immigrated. He left the land of Israel to teach Torah in Bavel, and it says he got there and he discovered that they were saying Hallel on Rosh Hodesh, and he thought to stop them. Hey, what are you guys doing? You shouldn't be doing this. And then he realized that they're skipping parts of it, and he realized, oh, it's just a minhag. They're not saying the complete Hallel. They're somehow marking Rosh Hodesh. I've talked about this before. I could look up the shiur where I try to hypothesize why they would pick, of anything they could do, why recite Hallel on Rosh Hodesh if it's a day when you're not supposed to say Hallel. So decide, yeah, but it's Rosh Hodesh, we're going to say Hallel anyways. Why did they choose to do that? But for now, we have this incident and described. By the way, there's among the Rishonim, there's a long discussion, very interesting discussion there. Should the bracha be said thereon? Person saying Hallel on Rosh Hodesh, he's only saying the half version, so-called half version. So does he recite a blessing beforehand? And every single opinion exists. There are those who say yes, and those who say absolutely not. And those who say it's optional. Everybody tries to find allusions in the story to prove their point. Some say, like Rabbeinu Tam, that Rav was there in shul. He heard them say the bracha like they should have, and he heard them starting to say Hallel, and then he thought to stop them until they skipped. The fact is that he was only realized that what they're doing is not the real recitation because they were skipping, but not because they left out the bracha, implying that the blessing is recited. And others say no, he was even late to that. They point out another story. Rav had a terrible stomach bug when he first got to Bavel, and Shmuel tried to treat him. Shmuel was his colleague there, and also apparently an ancient physician. And so Rav actually came into the synagogue during the recitation of Hallel and thought to stop them. And he had missed the beginning, he assumed they might have said a bracha, but it turns out they didn't. If he had been there even at the beginning, he wouldn't have tried to stop them even in the middle, because he would have realized there's no blessing recited there. Others give more complicated opinions. And first, we have to introduce the fact that we do have a practice that we say the half Hallel on the latter 6 days of Passover, even though the Gemara says not to say Hallel those days. Where did that come from? And as many people point out, for example, Rambam in the Mishnah Torah assumes this. And this is what says in Shulchan Aruch, this says in other Rishonim. It is an assumption that just like they started saying Hallel, Chatzi Hallel, half Hallel, on Rosh Hodesh, they start doing so on the latter days of Passover. But I have not found a Talmudic precedent for that. As a matter of fact, I'm actually looking right now, and I'm making a public request. I've requested for other people here, my neighbors also, other scholars trying to find an answer. Where do we find the historical precedent, the first time that Jews were saying the half Hallel on Passover? Now, there's a lot of reasons why you should. Remember, the Gemara has a Havamina at least. It's probably days that you should say Hallel, but you can't say Hallel on those days. In Rosh Hodesh, the day maybe you should say Hallel. No, the Gemara's conclusion is you don't say Hallel on those days. There are those who say there's more of a reason to recite a blessing on the half Hallel of Rosh Hodesh. Why? Because Hallel then is important. That's what marks Rosh Hodesh, and people have to know when Rosh Hodesh is every month. Whereas the latter days of Passover, it doesn't mark anything. People know it's Passover. And others argue that no, on Passover, the latter days thereof, it's more important to recite the blessing on the half Hallel, because that is actually a day when miracles happened, there's salvation, etc. But nothing historically happened every single day of Rosh Hodesh. And that's why you see that there's all different opinions about when to recite the bracha. I gave the first 3 opinions. Treat them all the same. They say Maimonides equates the 2 days. Most opinions equate them. If you say a bracha on half Hallel on Pesach, you would say it on Rosh Hodesh, and vice versa. And if you don't say the bracha, you don't say the bracha. And if it's optional on both days. And the opinions that say a bracha specifically on Passover, or say a bracha specifically on Rosh Hodesh, those are not so well known today, and they haven't been espoused by any recent authorities. And now I believe I will try to answer sort of my question, this thing I was talking about. I said that the Gemara, and indeed the way the classic Sephardic way of reciting the blessing, assumes that saying Hallel means completing the Hallel. Ligmor et Hallel, to complete the Hallel, or to finish the Hallel. Now, why would the Gemara use that term? If there was no concept of half Hallel when the Gemara is having this discussion back in the olden days, so why does it matter finish the Hallel? Just say recite the Hallel. Why finish the Hallel? It must be because there is a concept of not finishing Hallel. There's Hallel, but unfinished Hallel, what we would call Chatzi Hallel. And this idea of an unfinished Hallel predates the official adoption of the practice to recite the Hallel in abridged form on Rosh Hodesh. That is, there was this concept. It wasn't fully used. It wasn't established, but it exists, which is why Rav, for example, was a little bit calmed down when he saw that they were skipping Hallel. The fact is that even Rav knew of this concept that if one were to not finish the Hallel, that is, abridge the Hallel, it's already not the mitzvah, and it could be technically used at other times. It was already a concept. And therefore, the fact is that people could technically finish Hallel in other situations. I don't know of any other situation that calls for it on the Jewish calendar, but it's always an option to be used. And I'd like feedback, of course. Now I have to go try to speak to the right people about this one. I think that could be the explanation. I'd like to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Send your questions or comments. I'd like to thank the people who asked the question that provoked this today's shir. And don't forget, keep studying. Try to find the answers. They're out there.